Number 1. John Allen Muhammad. Imagine driving to fill up your gas tank on an ordinary October morning, completely unaware that you're being watched through a rifle scope from hundreds of yards away. That was the terrifying reality for millions of people living in the Washington, D.C. area in the fall of 2002, when a series of calculated attacks turned everyday activities into potentially fatal encounters. John Allen Muhammad seemed like many other men struggling to find their footing after military service. Born in Louisiana in 1960, he joined the Nation of Islam and eventually enlisted in the Army, where he earned expert marksman status. Those who knew him in his earlier years described someone charismatic and intelligent, capable of commanding attention in any room. He married, had children, and from the outside appeared to be building a conventional American life. But beneath that surface, something far darker was taking shape. The terror began in February 2002, though no one connected the dots at first. A string of incidents across the country seemed random and unrelated. But by October, the pattern became impossible to ignore. People were being struck down in parking lots, at gas stations, outside stores, going about the most mundane tasks of daily life. The attacks seemed to follow no logic, no pattern that investigators could identify. A man mowing his lawn, a woman loading groceries, a student on a bench. Each victim appeared to be chosen at random, which made the threat feel omnipresent and inescapable. What made these attacks particularly chilling was their precision and cold calculation. The shooter maintained significant distance, used a modified vehicle as a mobile sniper's nest, and disappeared before anyone could react. Parents kept children home from school. People crouched behind their cars while pumping gas, zigzagging through parking lots, afraid to stand still for even a moment. An entire metropolitan region of millions was held hostage by an unseen threat. The investigation became one of the largest manhunts in American history. Thousands of tips poured in daily. Law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions worked around the clock, but the shooter seemed to stay one step ahead. Then came the taunting communications, cryptic messages that seemed designed to mock authorities and instill even more fear. The words, "I am God," appeared in one message, revealing the grandiose delusions driving these attacks. The break came from an unexpected direction. Muhammad wasn't working alone. His teenage companion, someone who looked up to him almost like a father figure, was spotted with him at one of the scenes. A tip about a blue Caprice sedan led authorities to a rest stop in Maryland, where they found both men sleeping in the vehicle. Inside was a Bushmaster rifle, modified with a shooting hole cut into the trunk, transforming the car into a mobile execution chamber. The evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched the rifle to multiple crime scenes. The vehicle contained maps, materials for more attacks, and DNA evidence. But the legal process would be complicated by the sheer scope of the crimes, which spanned multiple states and jurisdictions, each wanting justice for their victims. Virginia moved first, charging Muhammad with capital murder in the case of one victim at a gas station. The trial revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Prosecutors laid out how Muhammad had planned these attacks methodically, how he'd manipulated his young accomplice, and how the violence was driven by a toxic mixture of anger at his ex-wife, delusions of power, and a desire to create chaos. The defense attempted to argue that the younger accomplice was the actual shooter, but the evidence pointed to Muhammad as the mastermind and primary shooter. In November 2003, the jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase was equally swift, with jurors recommending the ultimate penalty. The judge agreed, and Muhammad was sentenced to be executed. Appeals would continue for years, as they do in all capital cases, but the legal conclusion seemed inevitable. On November 10, 2009, John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in Virginia. He was 58 years old. He showed no remorse, offered no apology to the families whose lives he'd shattered. In total, the attacks he orchestrated had claimed 10 lives and wounded 3 others, with additional incidents likely connected to the same spree across the country. What drives someone to terrorize an entire region, to turn the simple act of running errands into a life-or-death gamble? The answers remain as troubling as they are incomplete. Here was a man with military training, intelligence, and once had people who cared about him, who chose instead to become an architect of random terror. The scars he left behind extend far beyond the immediate victims, touching everyone who lived through those 3 weeks when nowhere felt safe. Number 2. Lee Boyd Malvo. He was just 17 years old when he became one of the most feared individuals in America, a teenager who should have been thinking about college applications and weekend plans, but instead was looking through a rifle scope at unsuspecting strangers. Lee Boyd Malvo's story begins not with violence, but with abandonment and vulnerability. Born in Jamaica in 1985, his childhood was marked by instability and neglect. His mother struggled, often leaving him in the care of others, and the boy grew up without the foundation that most children take for granted. He was searching for something, someone to give his life direction and meaning. Unfortunately, he found exactly the wrong person. John Allen Muhammad entered Malvo's life when the boy was 14, and the older man quickly recognized an opportunity. Here was a lonely, impressionable teenager desperate for guidance and approval. Muhammad positioned himself as a father figure, a mentor, someone who finally saw value in the boy. But what Muhammad was actually doing was grooming a weapon, molding a child into an accomplice for acts of unspeakable violence. By 2002, Malvo had been thoroughly indoctrinated into Muhammad's twisted worldview. The teenager genuinely believed they were soldiers on a righteous mission, that the violence they were planning served some higher purpose. Muhammad had filled the boy's head with grandiose plans, talk of training camps and revolutionary action, all designed to make terrorism feel like heroism in the young man's mind. When the attacks began that fall, Malvo was an active participant. Investigators would later piece together evidence suggesting he may have pulled the trigger in several instances, though the full extent of his direct involvement remains debated. What's clear is that he was present, he assisted, and he believed in what they were doing. The brainwashing was so complete that even when opportunities arose to escape or seek help, Malvo stayed loyal to Muhammad. The arrest at that Maryland rest stop marked the beginning of Malvo's reckoning with reality. Separated from Muhammad's influence for the first time in years, the teenager began to gradually emerge from the fog of manipulation. But the legal system faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you prosecute a juvenile who committed heinous crimes while under the complete psychological control of an adult? Malvo was charged in multiple jurisdictions, and Virginia was among the first to bring him to trial. The evidence of his participation was clear, but the question of culpability was far more complex. His defense team brought in experts on psychological manipulation and coercive control, arguing that Malvo had essentially been converted into a weapon by Muhammad, that he'd been robbed of his ability to make independent moral choices. The prosecution acknowledged Muhammad's influence but argued that Malvo was old enough to understand that taking innocent lives was wrong, regardless of what his mentor told him. They presented his own words, his participation in planning, his apparent lack of remorse in the immediate aftermath. The jury found him guilty, but the question of sentencing revealed deep divisions about justice, punishment, and the possibility of redemption for someone so young. Malvo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, not just once, but multiple times as different jurisdictions prosecuted their cases. It seemed like a definitive end to his story, a teenager who would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars for crimes committed before he was legally allowed to vote. But the story didn't end there. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional. This decision opened the door for Malvo to challenge his sentences, arguing that his age and the unique circumstances of his psychological manipulation deserved consideration. Multiple courts have since grappled with his case, creating a complex legal situation that continues evolving. Today, Lee Boyd Malvo remains in prison, but unlike Muhammad, his future isn't entirely written. Some of his sentences have been modified to life with the possibility of parole, though whether he'll ever actually be released remains an open question. He's now in his late 30s, and by all accounts has spent his incarceration reflecting on his crimes and the path that led him there. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and youth. At what point is someone too young to be held fully accountable? Can genuine rehabilitation occur for someone involved in such calculated violence? Where's the line between being a perpetrator and being a victim? Malvo was both, and that complexity makes his case one that legal scholars and ethicists still debate. The families of those who were harmed will never get their loved ones back, and for many of them, Malvo's age and manipulation don't diminish his responsibility. Others see a cautionary tale about how vulnerable young people can be twisted by malicious adults. Perhaps both perspectives hold truth, as uncomfortable as that may be to accept. Number 3, Ian Kevin Huntley. In small towns, everyone knows everyone, and certain people become fixtures of community life, trusted faces you see regularly without a second thought. Ian Huntley was one of those people in Soham, England, a school caretaker who seemed helpful and friendly, always ready with a smile and a wave. That familiarity made what happened next almost incomprehensible. Huntley had grown up in Grimsby, and his early life appeared unremarkable to most observers. He drifted through various jobs, eventually finding work in schools, positions that brought him into regular contact with children. Those who knew him casually described someone ordinary, perhaps a bit odd, but nothing that raised serious alarms. They had no idea about the pattern of behavior that had followed him from place to place, allegations and suspicions that had somehow never quite caught up with him. By 2002, he was living in Soham with his girlfriend, who worked at the local school as a teaching assistant. Huntley had secured a position as the caretaker at Soham Village College, giving him keys, access, and a reason to be around the premises at all hours. To parents and children, he was just part of the landscape, someone so ordinary he was practically invisible. August 4th, 2002, started as a beautiful summer day. Two 10-year-old girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, were best friends enjoying the last days of their school holiday. They were inseparable, always together, full of the kind of innocent joy that should define childhood. That evening, they decided to walk into town, still wearing their matching Manchester United jerseys. It was meant to be a quick outing, the kind of simple freedom that children in small towns should be able to enjoy without fear. They never made it home. As evening turned to night and the girls failed to return, their families grew worried, then frantic. Within hours, a massive search operation was launched. Volunteers combed the area, police coordinated efforts across the region, and media attention quickly made this a national story. Everyone held on to hope that the girls had simply wandered too far and would be found safe. In the early days of the search, Ian Huntley positioned himself as a concerned community member. He spoke to the media, gave interviews about how he'd briefly seen the girls that evening, and expressed sympathy for the families. He seemed genuinely eager to help, which made sense for a school employee who'd known the children. No one suspected that behind his helpful facade, he knew exactly where the girls were. The investigation intensified as days passed, with no sign of Holly or Jessica. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, followed countless leads, and analyzed CCTV footage frame by frame. One piece of footage showed the girls walking past Huntley's home, and he'd already admitted to seeing them briefly. His story was that they'd stopped by asking about his girlfriend. He'd told them she wasn't home, and they'd walked on. It seemed plausible, and initially investigators had no reason to doubt him, but inconsistencies began emerging in Huntley's accounts. Small details that didn't quite match up, behaviors that seemed off, a nervousness that went beyond normal concern. Detectives started looking more closely at the school caretaker who'd been so eager to insert himself into the investigation. They discovered he'd recently cleaned his car obsessively, had burned items in a metal container, and had called in sick to work despite appearing fine when speaking to the media. 13 days after the girls disappeared, their bodies were discovered in a remote location, a ditch near an airbase miles from Soham. They'd been placed there deliberately, an attempt to conceal them that had nearly succeeded. The investigation immediately refocused. Now a murder inquiry, and Ian Huntley moved from helpful witness to primary suspect within hours. The evidence began piling up rapidly. Fiber analysis connected Huntley to the remote location. His car contained traces that proved he'd transported the girls. His phone records showed he'd been in the area where the bodies were found. Most damning, investigators discovered he'd changed his story multiple times about his interactions with Holly and Jessica that evening. Confronted with mounting evidence, Huntley was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. The trial in 2003 became one of the most closely watched in British history. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically, building an overwhelming case that Huntley had deliberately taken the girls' lives in his home, then transported and concealed their bodies. The defense attempted to argue accidental demise, a preposterous claim given the evidence of concealment and deception, but it was their only avenue. Huntley took the stand in his own defense, a calculated risk that backfired spectacularly. Under cross-examination, his story fell apart completely. He claimed one girl had drowned in his bathtub while he was helping her with a nosebleed, and that the other had been accidentally smothered when he tried to quiet her. Not a single person believed this fantastical account, including the jury. The verdict came on December 17, 2003, guilty on both counts of murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion as families finally heard the word they'd been waiting for. Huntley was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years before even being eligible for parole consideration. His girlfriend was convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice for providing him with a false alibi, though she was ultimately acquitted of knowing about the murders themselves. The case prompted massive reforms in the UK regarding background checks for people working with children. It emerged that Huntley had been the subject of multiple allegations in previous locations, but a failure in record keeping meant this information wasn't available when he applied for the school position. The system had failed to protect Holly and Jessica, and changes were implemented to ensure such failures couldn't happen again. Ian Huntley remains in prison today, serving his life sentence. He's been attacked multiple times by other inmates, attempted to take his own life on several occasions, and remains one of the most reviled prisoners in the British system. He'll be eligible for parole consideration in 2042 when he'd be in his late 60s, but the likelihood of him ever being released is essentially zero. For Soham, the trauma of August 2002 never fully faded. The community's innocence was shattered, replaced by the knowledge that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. Holly and Jessica should have grown up, gone to university, started careers, fallen in love, lived full lives, Instead, they're frozen in time as 10-year-old girls in football jerseys, a reminder of childhood cut horrifically short by someone who betrayed the most basic duty of adults to protect the vulnerable. Number 4. Danilo Restivo. Some people move through life leaving barely a trace, while others leave patterns so distinctive they eventually become impossible to ignore. Danilo Restivo was the latter, an Italian immigrant to England whose peculiar fixation would eventually connect him to violence across 2 countries and decades. Restivo was born in Italy in 1972 and spent his early years in Sicily before moving to England as an adult. To neighbors in Bournemouth, he seemed like a quiet, somewhat odd foreigner, but nothing particularly alarming. He lived in the same apartment building as his eventual victim, Heather Barnett, a divorced mother of 2 who made her living as a seamstress working from her home. They'd exchange polite greetings in passing, the kind of minimal interaction typical between neighbors who don't really know each other. But Restivo was far from ordinary. He had a strange compulsion involving hair, specifically cutting the hair of women and girls without permission. Multiple incidents had been reported in Bournemouth of women having their hair cut while on buses or in public spaces, though the perpetrator had never been identified. It seemed like bizarre but relatively harmless behavior, the kind of thing that made people uncomfortable but didn't necessarily trigger serious alarm. November 12, 2002, started as a normal school day for Heather's children. Their mother was home working, and they left that morning with no reason to think anything was wrong. When they returned that afternoon, they made a discovery that would haunt them forever. Their mother was deceased in her bedroom, and the scene was deliberately staged in a way that suggested this wasn't a random attack. Someone had positioned her body carefully, and most disturbingly, had placed cut locks of hair in her hands, hair that wasn't her own. The investigation immediately recognized this wasn't a typical crime of passion or a burglary gone wrong. The staging, the hair, the lack of forced entry, all suggested someone who knew Heather, someone with access to her home, and someone with a very specific psychological signature. Detectives began interviewing everyone in the building, and Danilo Restivo quickly drew attention. When questioned, Restivo seemed nervous, evasive, his story about his whereabouts on the day of the crime inconsistent and vague. But investigators lacked physical evidence directly connecting him to the scene, and the case went cold despite strong suspicions. For years, Restivo remained free, living in the same community, while Heather's family waited for justice that seemed like it might never come. Then investigators made a connection that changed everything. They began looking into Restivo's background in Italy and discovered he'd been a suspect in another remarkably similar case years earlier. In 1993, a young woman named Elisa Claps had disappeared after meeting someone at a church in Potenza, Italy. Restivo had been one of the last people seen with her, and he'd told conflicting stories about their meeting. Despite suspicion, no body had been found, and no charges were filed. In 2010, nearly 17 years after her disappearance, Elisa's remains were finally discovered in a storage loft in that same church, where they'd been hidden all along. The similarities to Heather's case were striking. The concealment, the staging, and most notably, cut locks of hair that didn't belong to the victim. The pattern was unmistakable, and investigators now had enough to move forward. Restivo was arrested and charged with Heather Barnett's murder. The trial brought together evidence from both countries, painting a picture of a man with a dangerous compulsion who'd gotten away with violence once and believed he could do so again. Fiber evidence connected him to Heather's home. Witnesses testified about his odd behavior and lies, and most compelling, experts explained how the hair signatures in both cases pointed to the same perpetrator. The defense attempted to argue the evidence was circumstantial, that similarities between cases didn't prove anything definitive. But the jury saw through these arguments. The pattern was too specific, too unusual to be coincidental. On June 25, 2011, Danilo Restivo was found guilty of murdering Heather Barnett and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 40 years. Italian authorities also wanted him prosecuted for Elisa Claps's disappearance, and in 2019, he was finally convicted of her murder as well, receiving an additional 30 years. The two convictions ensured that Restivo, now in his 50s, would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. His case highlights how certain behavioral patterns can be so distinctive they function almost like fingerprints. The compulsion involving hair wasn't just a quirk, it was a signature that ultimately connected crimes across time and distance. It also revealed the tragic consequences of early warning signs being dismissed as merely strange rather than potentially dangerous. For Heather's children and Elisa's family, the convictions brought some measure of closure, though nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Two women from different countries, different circumstances, connected by the tragedy of crossing paths with someone whose compulsions turned deadly. If only those earlier incidents of haircutting had been taken more seriously. If only the Italian investigation had been more thorough. Perhaps at least one of these lives could have been saved. Number 5. Aileen Wuornos. By the time October 2002 arrived, her name had already become synonymous with a particular kind of American horror story, the rare female serial killer whose crimes and troubled life had been dissected in countless documentaries, books, and eventually a Hollywood film. But for Aileen Wuornos, that October morning would be her last. She was born Aileen Carol Pittman in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, into circumstances that seemed designed to produce tragedy. Her father was incarcerated and later took his own life. Her mother abandoned her, and she was raised by grandparents who, by most accounts, subjected her to terrible mistreatment. By 13, she was living on the streets, surviving through whatever means necessary. By 15, she'd given birth to a child she immediately gave up for adoption. The trajectory of her life seemed set from the beginning, a cascade of trauma and survival that left deep psychological scars. For years, she existed on the margins, hitchhiking along Florida highways, exchanging companionship for money, sleeping rough, drinking heavily. She had brief relationships, including one with a woman named Tyria Moore, who would eventually play a crucial role in her capture. To the men who picked her up, she was anonymous, forgettable, one of countless invisible people struggling at the edge of society. But between 1989 and 1990, something in Aileen Wuornos snapped. Over the course of roughly a year, she shot and took the lives of 7 men who'd picked her up while she was hitchhiking along Florida highways. Her method was consistent: accept a ride, agree to go somewhere remote, then produce a weapon and open fire. She'd steal their money, valuables, and sometimes their vehicles, leaving their bodies in wooded areas off the highway. The investigation connected the cases relatively quickly. The victims were all middle-aged men. All had picked up hitchhikers. All were found in similar locations, and all had been shot with the same caliber weapon. Police had a general description, but struggled to identify their suspect, until they got a break from pawn shops where stolen items had been sold, and the trail led them to Wuornos. When confronted, she initially tried to claim self-defense, insisting that each man had assaulted her or attempted to do so, and she'd fought back in fear for her life. This claim gained some initial traction, particularly among advocates who understood the very real dangers faced by women in her situation. The first trial focused on just one victim, and her defense centered on this self-defense argument. But as evidence emerged from the other cases, the self-defense claim became harder to sustain. The sheer number of incidents, the consistency of her method, the theft of valuables and vehicles all suggested something more calculated than spontaneous self-defense. Prosecutors argued she'd become a predator, using her vulnerability as bait to lure men to isolated locations where she'd rob and eliminate them. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder in the first case in 1992, and she received the ultimate punishment. Over the next few years, she pled guilty or no contest to 5 additional murders, receiving additional sentences for each. Throughout the legal proceedings, her mental state remained a subject of debate. Was she a calculated serial killer, or someone so damaged by trauma and mental illness that she couldn't be held fully accountable? By the time her execution date approached in 2002, Wuornos had become a cause célèbre for various groups. Some feminists saw her as a victim of patriarchal violence who'd simply fought back. Mental health advocates pointed to clear evidence of psychological disorders and questioned the ethics of executing someone so obviously unwell. Opponents of capital punishment used her case to argue against the practice entirely. But for the families of her victims, these arguments rang hollow. Their loved ones were gone, killed by someone who, regardless of her own suffering, had made calculated choices to end their lives. The debate about Wuornos' culpability and mental state, while important, couldn't change what she'd done. On October 9, 2002, at the age of 46, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her final words were defiant and strange, claiming she'd be back like in the movie Independence Day, riding on a mothership. The statement seemed to confirm for many observers that she remained deeply mentally disturbed until the end. Her case continues to generate debate and fascination 2 decades after her demise. Multiple books, documentaries, and the 2003 film Monster, for which Charlize Theron won an Academy Award, have attempted to make sense of her life and crimes. Was she a cold-blooded predator or a damaged person who finally struck back at a world that had abused her? Can someone be both victim and perpetrator? And if so, how does society balance justice with mercy? These questions don't have easy answers. And perhaps that's why the case of Aileen Wuornos continues to resonate. She exists in an uncomfortable space that challenges simple narratives about good and evil. Her childhood was undeniably horrific. The life she led was desperate and dangerous, and the violence she eventually committed was real and devastating. All of these things can be true simultaneously. What we do know is that 7 men lost their lives, 7 families were shattered, and 1 damaged woman's story ended on an execution table in Florida. Whether that outcome represents justice or tragedy likely depends on which angle you view it from, and that ambiguity might be the most unsettling aspect of all. Number 6. Levi Belfield. He looked ordinary, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Tall, heavy-set, often working as a bouncer or in other security roles that ironically required projecting safety and control. But behind that unremarkable exterior was someone who harbored dark obsessions and violent impulses that would eventually make him one of Britain's most notorious criminals. Levi Belfield was born in London in 1968 and grew up in a working-class family. Those who knew him in his younger years described someone with a quick temper and controlling tendencies, particularly toward women. He cycled through relationships and jobs, leaving behind a pattern of domestic discord and unsettling behavior. But nothing in his early life obviously predicted what was to come, or perhaps the warning signs were there but went unrecognized until it was too late. By 2002, Belfield was living in West London, working various jobs including as a wheel clamper and bouncer. He had access to vehicles through his work, and he spent considerable time driving around southwest London, apparently searching. Investigators would later piece together that he had a specific type of victim in mind. Young, blonde women, often resembling his ex-girlfriends, targets for rage he'd been nurturing for years. March 4th, 2002, 19-year-old Marcia McDonald was walking home from a night out with friends in Hampton. It was late, but the route was familiar, and she'd walked it countless times before. She had no way of knowing she was being followed, watched by someone who'd marked her as fitting his preferred victim profile. As she walked along the quiet street, Belfield approached from behind and struck her in the head with a blunt object, likely a hammer. The attack was savage and sudden, and Marcia collapsed on the pavement. She was rushed to the hospital but never regained consciousness, passing away 2 days later. The investigation initially struggled to find leads. There were no witnesses to the actual attack, no obvious motive, no connection between Marcia and any suspects. It appeared to be a completely random act of violence, which made it both terrifying and seemingly impossible to solve. Who attacks a stranger so brutally for no apparent reason? The answer, it turned out, was someone who'd been building toward violence for a long time. But Marcia wasn't Belfield's only victim. In August 2003, he attacked 19-year-old Edith Colon, who miraculously survived despite suffering severe head injuries. Then, in August 2004, he struck again, this time taking the life of Amélie Delagrange, a 22-year-old French student, using the same brutal method, a hammer attack from behind on a quiet street. Just weeks later, he attempted to take the life of Kate Sheedy, an 18-year-old who survived being deliberately run over by a vehicle Belfield was driving. The attacks appeared random, but investigators eventually identified patterns. All the victims were young women, most were blonde, all were attacked in southwest London, and several involved similar methods. As evidence accumulated from the later attacks, detectives began looking back at unsolved cases, including Marcia McDonald's demise. Vehicle descriptions, witness accounts, and CCTV footage from various scenes began pointing toward the same individual. The breakthrough came from Belfield's personal life. Multiple ex-partners came forward describing his controlling behavior, his obsession with blonde women, his violent temper, and his suspicious activities during the time periods when the attacks occurred. One ex-girlfriend provided information about vehicles he'd had access to, and this matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. In November 2004, Belfield was arrested. The evidence against him was substantial. Vehicle forensics, witness identifications, cell phone tower data placing him near multiple crime scenes, and testimony from people who knew him about his patterns and behaviors. He denied everything, attempting to construct alibis that quickly fell apart under scrutiny. The trial for Amelie's demise and Kate's attempted harm began in 2007. Prosecutors presented a meticulous case built on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and pattern analysis across multiple incidents. The jury heard how Belfield would cruise around in his vehicle, hunting for victims who matched his preferred type, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The randomness that had initially made the crime seem unsolvable actually revealed a pattern once investigators understood what they were looking for. On February 25, 2008, Levi Belfield was found guilty on multiple counts, including murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. But the story didn't end there. Investigators continued examining unsolved cases, and attention turned to another horrific crime that bore Belfield's signature. In March 2002, the same month as Marcia McDonald's demise, 13-year-old Amanda Dowler, known as Millie, had disappeared while walking home from school in Surrey. Her body was found months later, and the case had remained unsolved despite massive investigative efforts. As detectives looked more carefully at Belfield's movements and methods, disturbing connections emerged. In 2011, Belfield was charged with Millie Dowler's abduction and killing. The evidence was more circumstantial than in his other convictions, but the pattern matched, and vehicle evidence placed him in the area. The trial was emotionally devastating, particularly for Millie's family, who had to endure hearing details of their daughter's final hours. On June 23, 2011, Belfield was convicted of her killing as well, ensuring that even his whole life sentence had essentially been doubled. Levi Belfield remains in prison, housed in the highest security conditions, universally reviled as one of Britain's worst offenders. He's attempted to generate attention over the years through various claims and stunts, but the public interest is in seeing him forgotten rather than given any platform. His case raised important questions about how many other attacks he might have been responsible for that remain unsolved. Investigators believe the incidents he was convicted of represent only a fraction of his violence, and several other cases bear his hallmarks. But without sufficient evidence, he'll never be charged with those crimes, leaving some families without closure. The randomness of his violence is perhaps its most terrifying aspect. Marcia McDonnell wasn't killed because of anything she did or anyone she knew. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, matching a profile that existed only in her attacker's disturbed mind. That arbitrary nature makes it impossible for anyone to feel completely safe. Because how do you protect yourself from a threat you can't see coming? Number 7. Terry Peter Rasmussen. Some criminals leave behind a single horrific crime, while others leave a trail of mysteries spanning decades, victims whose identities remain unknown, families never finding closure, and a web of deception so tangled that unraveling it becomes nearly impossible. Terry Rasmussen was that kind of criminal, a man with so many aliases that even determining his real name took investigators years. He was born in 1943 in Colorado, and his early life appeared relatively normal. He married, had children, and seemed to be building a conventional life. But beneath that surface, something was very wrong. He abandoned his family in the late 1970s, and from that point forward, he essentially became a ghost, moving from place to place under different names, leaving behind a trail of abandoned partners and missing persons that wouldn't be connected for decades. Rasmussen was a chameleon, adopting new identities with ease. He'd arrive in a new place, charm people with stories about his background, form relationships, and then disappear without warning, often taking children with him. Those who knew him under various aliases described someone who could be engaging and helpful one moment, then cold and threatening the next. But few saw the full darkness behind the facades he constructed. The case that would eventually lead to his identification began in 1985, when a barrel was discovered in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, containing the remains of a woman and a child. The condition of the remains made identification impossible with the technology available at the time, and the case went cold. Then in 2000, a second barrel was found in the same area, this one containing the remains of 2 more children. Someone had carefully hidden multiple victims in a remote location, hoping they'd never be found. For years, investigators struggled to identify both the victims and their killer. The remains were too degraded for conventional identification, and no missing persons reports seemed to match. The case became known as the Bear Brook murders, a haunting mystery with 4 nameless victims and no clear path to solving it. Meanwhile, Rasmussen continued his pattern of moving, assuming new identities, and forming relationships that would end in abandonment or worse. In the 1980s, using the name Bob Evans, he was living in New Hampshire, and people who knew him during that period would later realize his timeline aligned perfectly with the Bear Brook murders. But at the time, no one connected the friendly man who helped with odd jobs to the horrors hidden in those barrels. In 2002, Rasmussen was finally convicted of a crime, though it wasn't the murders that would later be connected to him. Using the name Larry Vanner, he'd been living in California with a woman named Yoon Jun. When she disappeared, he claimed she'd gone to visit family, but her friends grew suspicious. Her body was eventually found, and evidence pointed to Rasmussen. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison. Even then, investigators didn't immediately realize they'd caught someone connected to crimes spanning decades. It was only when advancing DNA technology allowed for new analysis of the Bear Brook remains that connections began emerging. The woman in the first barrel was determined to be the mother of the children in the second barrel, a horrific revelation that raised more questions than answers. Detectives working the Bear Brook case began submitting DNA to genealogical databases, a technique that was just becoming viable. They discovered that their unidentified suspect had living relatives, and through painstaking genealogical research, they finally identified him. Terry Peter Rasmussen, who'd been living under the name Larry Vanner and was already in prison for Yoon Soon-Jun's demise. The revelation opened up decades of cold cases for review. Investigators began connecting Rasmussen to multiple unsolved missing persons cases, abandoned children found in various states, and a pattern of violence that stretched across the country. He'd been hiding in plain sight for over 30 years, and only now was the full scope of his crimes coming into focus. But there was a problem. Rasmussen wasn't going to provide answers. He'd died in prison in 2010, taking his secrets with him. Investigators were left piecing together his history from DNA evidence, records, and testimony from people who'd known him under various aliases. Even determining how many victims he'd claimed proved nearly impossible. The Bear Brook victims were eventually partially identified through DNA analysis. One child was determined to be Rasmussen's biological daughter, a heartbreaking revelation that he'd taken the life of his own child along with the others. The woman and the other children remain unidentified to this day. Nameless victims of a man who destroyed families and concealed his crimes with chilling effectiveness. Rasmussen's case highlighted both the horror of serial criminality and the power of advancing forensic science. Without modern DNA analysis and genealogical databases, he likely would have remained unidentified forever, his victims never connected, families never getting answers. The technology that finally revealed his identity came too late to bring him to justice for his worst crimes, but at least it provided some measure of truth. The only murder he was formally convicted of was Yoon Soon-Jun's, and that conviction came in 2003, just a year after the crime. He received 15 years to life, a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his days. But compared to the full scope of what he'd done, that single conviction seemed almost insignificant. For the families of his victims, both identified and still nameless, the knowledge that he's gone brings some small comfort, but it doesn't fill the void left by loved ones who disappeared without explanation. The Bear Brook case remains open, with investigators still working to identify the remaining victims and determine if Rasmussen was connected to other unsolved cases across the country. His story is a reminder that some criminals are caught not because of brilliant detective work or mistakes they make, but simply because technology eventually catches up to them. How many other cases from decades past might be solved if the right DNA databases existed, if the right genealogical connections could be made? And how many predators are out there right now, moving from place to place under different names, believing they'll never be caught? Number 8. Michael Wheatley. The British press called him various names, each one attempting to capture the casual brutality with which he approached violence. Michael Wheatley wasn't someone who carefully planned elaborate crimes or left investigators puzzling over complex mysteries. He was, in the most straightforward sense, a career criminal who escalated to violence and never looked back. Wheatley was born in 1954 and started his criminal career young. Petty thefts, burglaries, the usual progression that law enforcement sees in many offenders. But where some criminals eventually age out of crime or get caught and reformed, Wheatley simply got worse. By his 30s and 40s, he'd accumulated an extensive criminal record with multiple prison sentences that failed to deter him from returning to crime immediately upon release. What made Wheatley particularly dangerous was his willingness to use violence without hesitation. Many criminals commit property crimes and avoid confrontation, but Wheatley seemed to embrace it. During robberies, he'd use weapons, threaten victims, and escalate situations unnecessarily. He developed a reputation among police as someone genuinely dangerous, not just a burglar, but someone capable of serious harm. The crimes that would lead to his 13 life sentences occurred over a period of time in the late 1990s and early 2000s, though the exact details of each incident remain somewhat obscured by the sheer volume of his criminal activity. What's clear is that he graduated from robbery to lethal violence, taking lives during the commission of crimes and showing no remorse afterward. In one particularly brutal incident, he attacked an elderly victim during a burglary, beating them so severely that they didn't survive. In another, he shot someone during a confrontation related to criminal activity. The pattern repeated. Wheatley would commit a crime, encounter resistance or witnesses, and respond with lethal force rather than fleeing or de-escalating. What's striking about Wheatley's case is how preventable it should have been. He'd been in and out of the criminal justice system for decades, and each time he was released, he promptly resumed his criminal career. The system had multiple opportunities to recognize he represented an ongoing threat to public safety, but sentencing laws and prison policies meant he kept getting released, only to harm more victims. The investigation into his various crimes eventually connected multiple cases through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and his own patterns of behavior. He wasn't particularly clever about covering his tracks, relying more on intimidation and the chaos of his violence to avoid consequences. But as evidence accumulated and witnesses came forward, prosecutors built a case that encompassed multiple, serious offenses. The trial revealed the full scope of his criminal career. Prosecutors presented evidence of murder, attempted murder, robbery, assault, and a pattern of escalating violence that stretched back years. The defense had little to work with, no mitigating factors that could excuse or explain such persistent, casual brutality. Wheatley had made a career of victimizing people, and now the bill had come due. In 2002, Michael Wheatley was sentenced to 13 life sentences, an almost unprecedented number that reflected both the severity and volume of his crimes. The judge made clear that Wheatley represented an ongoing danger to society and would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The multiple life sentences weren't just symbolic. They ensured that even if one conviction was somehow overturned, he'd remain imprisoned on the others. For the families of his victims, the sentencing brought some closure, though it couldn't undo the harm or bring back those who'd been lost. What stood out in victim impact statements was the randomness of their suffering. These weren't people involved in criminal enterprises or feuds with Wheatley. They were ordinary people who happened to be in the wrong place when Wheatley decided to commit a crime, and they paid with their lives simply for being there. Wheatley remains in prison in the UK, and given his age and sentences, he'll almost certainly die there. Unlike some criminals who gain notoriety or become subjects of fascination, Wheatley remains relatively obscure, known primarily to those who study criminal justice policy rather than true crime enthusiasts. His case is more depressing than intriguing. A straightforward story of someone who chose violence repeatedly and destroyed multiple lives without apparent thought or remorse. His story raises important questions about criminal justice policy, particularly around repeat offenders who show clear patterns of escalation. At what point should society accept that someone is unlikely to be reformed and prioritize public safety over rehabilitation? How do you balance the principles of second chances with the reality that some individuals will use every chance to harm others? These questions don't have easy answers, and Wheatley's case provides no comfort to any particular viewpoint. What we're left with is a simple, tragic reality. Multiple people died because one person made bad choices repeatedly, and the system failed to stop him before he escalated to lethal violence. No elaborate mystery, no psychological complexity to unpack, just senseless harm caused by someone who valued his criminal lifestyle over human life. Number 9. Quincy Allen. The summer of 2002 should have been like any other in the Carolinas, hot and lazy, with people going about their routines without fear. But for several weeks, a predator moved between North and South Carolina, leaving a trail of victims and terrified communities in his wake. Quincy Allen wasn't someone most people would immediately identify as dangerous. He'd grown up in the area, known to some as a quiet person who kept mostly to himself. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something dark was taking shape. Impulses that would eventually manifest in a brief but devastating spree of violence. The attacks began in July 2002, though it would take time for investigators to connect them as the work of one person. The victims seemed random, selected not for who they were, but simply because they were accessible, vulnerable, alone at the wrong moment. Allen's method was direct and brutal. He'd approach, overpower, and eliminate his victims quickly, then disappear before anyone realized what had happened. The first victim was discovered in North Carolina, found in circumstances that immediately indicated intentional harm. As investigators began their work, they had little to go on. No witnesses had seen the attack. No obvious motive connected the victim to any suspects, and the crime scene offered limited forensic evidence. It appeared to be either a random act or something with personal motivation they hadn't yet uncovered. Then, just days later, another victim was discovered across the state line in South Carolina. The circumstances were disturbingly similar. A vulnerable person attacked and left deceased, no apparent connection to the victim, minimal forensic evidence. Law enforcement in both states began comparing notes, realizing they might be dealing with someone operating across jurisdictional boundaries. As July turned to August, 2 more victims were claimed. The attacks were escalating in frequency, and the similarities were too consistent to ignore. Investigators now knew they were hunting someone moving between the Carolinas, someone who was either spiraling out of control or working through some dark compulsion that demanded more victims. The investigation became a race against time. Every day that passed without an arrest meant another potential victim, another family that might be shattered. Law enforcement set up task forces combining resources from multiple agencies, analyzing every piece of evidence, interviewing anyone who might have seen something suspicious. The break came from a combination of witness accounts and physical evidence. Someone had noticed a vehicle near one of the crime scenes around the time of the attack, and that description matched a vehicle connected to another scene. License plate readers and traffic cameras provided additional data points, and investigators began focusing on vehicles that had been in the vicinity of multiple crimes. That trail led them to Quincy Allen. When they looked into his background, they found someone with no major prior criminal history. Nothing that obviously predicted he'd become someone who'd take multiple lives in quick succession. But sometimes people break in ways that aren't predictable, and the evidence increasingly pointed to him as their suspect. The arrest came in late August, ending the spree that had terrorized 2 states for nearly 2 months. Allen was taken into custody, and the evidence against him was substantial. Forensics connected him to multiple crime scenes. Witnesses identified him or his vehicle, and his own statements contained inconsistencies and lies that prosecutors would later use to dismantle any defense. The trial proceedings were relatively straightforward compared to more complex cases. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence methodically, building an undeniable case that Allen had been responsible for all four incidents. The defense attempted to argue various theories, but none could explain away the physical evidence or the pattern of his movements coinciding with each crime. Allen was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to lengthy terms that would effectively keep him imprisoned for life. The sentences were to be served consecutively, ensuring that even with good behavior or potential parole on individual counts, he wouldn't be released for decades at minimum. For the communities affected by his crimes, his capture and conviction brought relief but not complete closure. Four families had lost loved ones to senseless violence, taken by someone who'd offered no explanation for why he'd done what he'd done. The randomness of his victim selection made it even harder to process. There was no underlying logic, no way to make sense of why these particular people had been targeted. Quincy Allen remains incarcerated, serving his sentences in relative obscurity. Unlike more infamous criminals whose cases generate ongoing public interest, Allen's story is mostly known only to those directly affected and to law enforcement who studied his case. There are no documentaries or books, no theories debated by internet sleuths. He's simply a person who committed terrible crimes over a brief period and was caught and punished. His case is a reminder that not all criminals fit neat profiles or leave behind puzzles for investigators to solve. Sometimes the horror is in the very banality, in the fact that an unremarkable person can suddenly become a source of tragedy for no reason that makes sense to anyone else. The victims weren't part of some elaborate plot or conspiracy. They were simply people who happened to be in the path of someone whose darkness finally manifested in the worst possible way. Number 10. Robert Pickton. The neighborhood was called the Downtown East Side, and anyone familiar with Vancouver knew it as a place where society's most vulnerable people gathered, where survival was a daily struggle, and disappearances were disturbingly common. For years, women had been vanishing from these streets, and for years, their disappearances hadn't generated the urgency or resources that missing persons cases typically command. That changed when investigators finally looked closely at a pig farmer living on the outskirts of the city. Robert Pickton came from a farming family that had owned property in Port Coquitlam, just outside Vancouver, for generations. The Pickton farm was sprawling and poorly maintained, a collection of buildings, equipment, and mud where the family raised pigs for slaughter. Robert, known as Willie to some, was one of three siblings, and by most accounts, he was quiet, odd, someone who kept to himself and seemed uncomfortable in social situations. But the farm became known for something else: parties. Despite the squalid conditions, the Picktons hosted gatherings that attracted a rough crowd, events where substance use was common and vulnerable. Women from Vancouver's downtown east side would sometimes appear, brought by others or arriving on their own seeking money or temporary shelter. For years, advocacy groups had been trying to draw attention to missing women from the downtown east side. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of women had vanished, but because many were involved in survival-based activities or struggled with dependencies, their disappearances were often dismissed by authorities as people simply moving on or meeting unfortunate ends due to their lifestyles. Families and advocates insisted something more sinister was happening, but they struggled to get law enforcement to take the pattern seriously. Finally, in the late 1990s, the sheer volume of missing persons cases forced action. A task force was created to investigate, and they began looking at patterns, trying to determine if one person could be responsible for multiple disappearances. Various suspects were investigated, but evidence remained elusive. Then, in early 2002, acting on information from an informant, police executed a search warrant at the Pickton farm. What they found was beyond horrifying. The property was a nightmare of decay and contamination, and as forensic teams carefully searched through buildings, soil, and equipment, they began finding human remains. Not intact bodies, but fragments, traces of DNA, personal belongings that had belonged to women on the missing persons list. The processing of the crime scene would take months and involve some of the most disturbing forensic work in Canadian history. Robert Pickton was arrested in February 2002, initially on weapons charges while investigators gathered evidence for more serious accusations. As forensic analysis continued, the scope of his crimes became clearer. DNA evidence connected multiple victims to the property, and investigators began piecing together a horrific picture of what had happened to the missing women. The theory that emerged was almost too disturbing to comprehend. Pickton had been luring vulnerable women to his farm, where he'd take their lives and then dispose of their remains using the farm's pig processing equipment. The farm's legitimate business of raising pigs for slaughter provided perfect cover for concealing evidence, and the isolated location meant he could operate without witnesses. By the time charges were formally filed, Pickton was accused of being responsible for dozens of disappearances. The investigation identified evidence related to at least 26 victims, though the true number might be higher. Many bodies were never found, and contamination of the property made definitive identification impossible in some cases. The trial, which began in 2006, was one of the longest and most expensive in Canadian history. Due to the number of charges and complexity of evidence, the court split the cases, trying Pickton first for 6 counts of second-degree murder. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, DNA analysis, and testimony from witnesses who'd been to the farm or had dealings with Pickton. The defense argued that Pickton might have been involved but wasn't the only person responsible, suggesting others had participated in the crimes. This theory was never substantiated, and it seemed more like an attempt to create reasonable doubt than a genuine alternative explanation supported by evidence. In December 2007, after months of testimony and evidence, the jury found Robert Pickton guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. The verdict was somewhat controversial because it was second-degree rather than first-degree, suggesting the jury believed the killings weren't entirely premeditated. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available. The Crown had planned to proceed with charges for the remaining victims, but in 2010, they stayed those charges, citing the expense and trauma of another trial when Pickton was already serving the maximum sentence. This decision was deeply painful for families of the other victims, who felt their loved ones were being treated as less important. Robert Pickton remains in prison, and he'll be eligible for parole consideration in 2032, though the likelihood of him ever being released is minimal. But even more disturbing than his crimes is what they revealed about systemic failures. For years, vulnerable women had been disappearing, and their cases hadn't been prioritized because of who they were and the lives they'd been forced to lead. The prejudice and neglect of authorities allowed Pickton to operate for far longer than should have been possible. The case prompted major reforms in how police handle missing persons cases and forced uncomfortable conversations about how society values different lives differently. It also highlighted the particular vulnerability of women working in survival situations who face dangers that most people never have to consider and whose disappearances are often met with assumptions rather than investigations. For the families of the victims, many questions remain unanswered. How many women did Pickton actually harm? Were others involved, as his defense suggested? Why did it take so long for authorities to connect the disappearances and investigate seriously? These questions will likely never be fully resolved. Another layer of tragedy added to already unbearable loss. The downtown East Side continues to struggle with many of the same issues today, though increased awareness and advocacy have improved responses to missing persons cases. But nothing can change what happened on that pig farm or bring back the women who disappeared into its horror. Their names are remembered now, honored by advocates and family members who refuse to let them be forgotten or dismissed. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, people whose lives had value regardless of their circumstances, and they deserved better from the society that failed to protect them. These 10 cases from 2002 represent different facets of human darkness: calculated terror, manipulated youth, betrayed trust, compulsive violence, traumatized retaliation, predatory hunting, decades of deception, career criminality, sudden sprees, and systemic failures. Each leaves us with uncomfortable questions about justice, culpability, mental health, and how society responds to the most vulnerable. Some were caught through brilliant investigation, others through advancing technology or their own mistakes. Some showed remorse, others remained defiant to the end. But all left behind shattered families, traumatized communities, and reminders that evil can wear the most ordinary faces. The year 2002 didn't create these criminals, but it became the year their stories reached their conclusions, whether through capture, trial, or execution. The scars they left behind remain, permanent marks on the lives they touched and the communities they terrorized.